Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour I want to talk about bedrock, and if you think about this, bedrock is very important. If you're going to be building a house or a building, you want to get down to bedrock, and that is going to give you a much more stable building than something on sinking sand. What about the bedrock of your faith? What about the bedrock of Christianity? That's what we're going to be talking about this hour, and I think you're going to find this very helpful because this new book is entitled The Bedrock of Christianity. It is written by my guest in studio, Dr. Justin Bass, who has his Ph.D. from Dallas Theological Seminary. He is a professor of New Testament at the Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And as an individual, even in the midst of writing, I think, a very readable book, has also debated some of these scholars, people that we've talked about on this program, like Bart Ehrman or Richard Carey or Dan Barker or the Mufti Hussan Kamani. So we've got some really great opportunity here to really talk about what it means to be a Christian and what we can base our faith upon on the real bedrock of Christianity. So, Justin Bass, just great to have you in studio with us.
Thanks for having me. Blessed to be here.
And again, I might just mention, normally you're in Jordan, so that's why when I could get you in studio, I wanted to do that as quickly as we can.
And if I just may say, I wanted to say I'm so fond to be here, and memories of my THM days at Dallas Theological Seminary, when Chaplain Bill would blow that trumpet and you would come in the chapel and you would answer any questions that the students had. Those are fond memories of the early 2000s when I was at DTS. Those are great days. So
They've
thanks for doing that.
They've paused that for a while, but they're going to have me there this fall.
Excellent.
You students could ask any question you want.
It was fun. I think I asked you some questions. I don't remember what they were, but I asked you some questions.
Man, I hope my answers were okay. But this time we're going to ask you the questions because this is an outstanding book. First of all, let me just say that, of course, you have great academic credentials. But you gotta love a guy that 1 minute's talking about Hamlet and Horatio, the next minute's talking about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. 1 minute you're talking about Bart Ehrman, the next minute you're talking about some kind of popular movie. So this is really well written, and I think this is going to be very helpful. So again, about 230 pages. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy. If you go to pointofview.net, click on the picture of Justin Bass, just scroll down. There is a way in which you can order it. It's very inexpensive and just great material. And so if you're a scholar and say, wait a minute, I want to see that, you got a bibliography that goes on for pages and pages and pages. But if you want to just have somebody that lives in the popular culture world, you'll enjoy that as well.
Yes.
Okay, I love how you start this. You know, it sounds like the beginning of a joke. Suppose that a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an agnostic, all honest historians, cognizant of the first century religious movements, were locked up in the bowels of the Harvard Divinity School library. But that's not really a joke. It's actually how a scholar starts his investigation, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, John Meyer, actually renowned historical Jesus scholar of early Christianity. This is how he begins the first of his, I think it's about 5 volumes, work on the historical Jesus. And he wanted to find where does everyone agree, whether Jew, whether atheist, agnostic, Catholic, Protestant, where does everyone agree when it comes to the sayings of Jesus? He's really focusing on the sayings and the deeds of Jesus. Where does everyone agree? And I wanted to start the book the same way because my book's in the same vein, but it's really focused on the specific events surrounding Jesus and his earliest followers, the earliest movement, and where everyone agrees, not just to like a 60 or 75% or 80%, agreement. We're talking everyone agrees, I would say, when it comes to teaching scholars, 100% pretty much, but I say 99% in the book just to allow for kind of the crazies on the internet, crazies on, people who make Facebook comments and comments on YouTube. You can't say 100% on anything with them. There are Holocaust deniers, there are moon landing deniers, so there's always those kind of people. But when it comes to the actual scholars with credentials, we're talking 99% agree on the facts, the bedrock facts that I lay out in this book.
We're going to talk about the bedrock facts. Let me just mention that the foreword's by Darrell Bach,
yes,
and certainly that is the case. And so you have a wonderful diagram, which I hope people, when they get the book, will look at, because you're really saying, okay, what is the bedrock of Christianity? And the first question that a lot of people would ask, well, what are your bedrock sources? Because that's very key. So help us understand the sources that you're going to be using as we work our way through this.
Yeah, and I use, for fun, I use Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure because it is just, one of the greatest philosophical and theological movies of all time. You probably know that William Lane Craig actually loves that movie.
Yes.
He says it fits his theory of time. But I use that movie as a way of time traveling because I like to talk, ever since I've been teaching in New Testament and history, I always like to talk about studying history is like time traveling. And so I try to take the reader on a journey through history and to discover these bedrock facts, but we have to start with the sources. And so we look at these bedrock sources that, again, all scholars agree on, that are reliable, who wrote it. And when it comes to the bedrock sources of the Bible, or at least of the New Testament, we're talking about Paul's early letters. So we're talking about 7 undisputed letters of Paul that unanimously today scholars agree Paul wrote, and the information within are reliable historically. And we're talking about Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and 1 Thessalonians.
Yes, and again, those are enough to really get your point across. And then that also brings you to the idea of bedrock facts, because not only do you have the sources, but the facts.
The facts that come from the sources.
And
exactly.
what's so interesting is, even Bart Ehrman, who is hardly orthodox, has set aside this idea that I've dealt with in some of my viewpoint commentaries, that we can honestly question whether Jesus ever existed.
Right.
And
we really appreciate Bart for writing that book. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? Just refuting that nonsense that we mainly find on the internet.
And again, that's a good point, because lots of times somebody will read it on the internet and they'll go, well, maybe people really believe that.
Exactly.
Even people that would not sign the doctrinal statement of the church where you are the pastor, or the doctrinal statement of the seminary where you teach, even those who would challenge every bit of it, even people you've debated, still say, come on, you just can't make those kinds of statements, right?
Yeah, and Bart Ehrman even spoke to a large group of these, what they call mythicists, people who deny Jesus' existence, and he basically just publicly rebuked them, and it's on YouTube. You can watch it. I quote what he said. He basically said, you just look foolish. You need to get on the bandwagon of what actual experts and scholars believe. It's an excellent rebuke to the mythicist community, and I think it kind of just definitively destroys them, along with his book.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into this time travel, because you have a whole section here on studying history as time traveling. Some people have said it's, well, as archaeology is kind of like paleontology, and since I've studied both of those, I thought that was kind of an interesting illustration. And then we'll look at these bedrock sources. Okay, what about 1 Corinthians 15? What about the crucifixion? What about the resurrection? What about all these appearances? What can we say with virtual certainty? Again, we'll only say 99%.
Yes.
But whether you are an individual who is Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, atheist, agnostic, if you're really an honest historian, what could you actually come to, and what is the bedrock of our faith? And so let me just mention, as we go to the break here, that this book is about 230 pages. It is really well done, because it has a section that causes some that are really asking questions to want to know about maybe, okay, where'd you find that? So there's a bibliography. Then there's a section on Scripture. And then there's even the whole source of ancient sources, because after all, you quote some of these ancient sources. So you can begin to sort through this in a way that would be very helpful. And so if you've got questions, but more importantly, if you're out there on Facebook or Twitter and you run into people that have questions, I think you're going to find some really good answers as we talk about the bedrock of Christianity. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Justin Bass right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a divided country. Os Guinness, in his book Last Call for Liberty, argues that the American Republic is suffering its greatest crisis since the Civil War, and he believes the root of this disagreement is two different definitions of freedom. One view of freedom is embodied in 1776 in the American Revolution. The other view arose in 1789 in the French Revolution. The first can be found in the Declaration of Independence that owes its formulation to the Protestant Reformation, and even earlier in the book of Exodus. The second can be found in France's Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité that ended in the Reign of Terror, to which we can add Marx's Triumph of the Proletariat and in the policies of Stalin and Mao Zedong. His book asks 10 questions that make up the chapters of the book. When he was in the studio with me talking about his book, I mentioned that few Americans could answer the questions in the affirmative. He asked, "Do you know where your freedom comes from?" Even fewer could offer good answers to questions like, "How do you plan to sustain freedom?" He also addresses the question, "How will you make the world safe for diversity?" Here we have two starkly different visions of public life. On the one side are proponents of what Richard John Neuhaus called a naked public square that would exclude religion and religious expressions from public life. Proponents of a sacred public square would give preference to one religion. He advocates for a civil public square where citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. This book provides wise counsel on how Christians can be at the forefront of bringing America back to its proper understanding of freedom. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Justin Bass. Might just mention this book is really an attempt to say, regardless of your feelings or your presuppositions, what are the bedrock truths about the life of Jesus? And Justin, for just a minute, let's talk about why you wrote this book, because in some respects, you're also trying to respond to some of the people, like Bart Ehrman, that you have debated, who, quite frankly, has probably led more young people to leave their Christian faith than any other individual, other than maybe the Richard Dawkins of the world and the so-called...
Especially in America.
The so-called new atheists. So this is a concern, and that's one of the reasons why you wrote this book, isn't it?
Yeah, one of the reasons for sure was, as I said before, I wanted in one place in this book to have all those 99% agreement bedrock facts. I wanted the sources and the facts. Where does everyone agree? So I'm not dealing with a lot of things that are debated that I'd love to deal with. I hope to deal with, maybe, God willing, in books after this. But in this book, I wanted to focus on just what I like to call in the book mere historical Christianity, because C.S. Lewis, wrote a book, one of the best books ever written, I think. One of the first books I read as a Christian, actually. But in Mere Christianity, he focuses on what are the doctrines that all Christians, whether Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Anglican, what do they all agree on? And he did that in that book. In this one, I'm trying to do where do we agree historically? What's the historic evidence that we all agree on? But I also I would really love to see kind of a new reformation, a reformation back to bedrock, because if you look at the earliest days of Christianity, when the apostles went out, of course, in Acts, and proclaimed the message of Christianity, their primary proclamation was the death and resurrection. If you look at every sermon in Acts,
that's true.
They are preaching the resurrection. So the resurrection really is the bedrock of our faith. It is the ultimate bedrock, not the Bible. I love the Bible. I read the Bible. I've been reading the Bible every year for 20 years now. I believe every jot and tittle is inspired and inerrant. But it is not our bedrock. Ultimately, our bedrock is not the Bible. And so I think this is so important because of people like, for example, Bart Ehrman. I use him as kind of a premier example. He grew up in an evangelical kind of fundamentalist experience. When he went to school, he tells a story at the beginning of misquoting Jesus. He tells the story of how when he thought, at least he believed, that there was an error in the Gospel of Mark, that his professor convinced him that there was this error in the Gospel of Mark, in Mark chapter 2. He believed that, wow, the floodgates have opened. That's actually his language. He said the floodgates had opened,
Yes.
and that led him down this path where ultimately he became an agnostic. Now, he'll tell you that he ultimately became an agnostic because of the problem of evil. That's fine, but what opened the floodgates, according to him, was thinking that there was an error. Now, if his bedrock was the resurrection, that error would be meaningless.
Yes.
Because even if Mark did make an error, I don't think he did, but even if he did, Jesus still rose from the dead. So you don't have to have inerrancy, you don't even have to have inspiration to know that Jesus rose from the dead. So I really want, with this book, I would love to see people go back to the bedrock of their faith, not the Bible, actually the resurrection.
And, sometimes I've said on this program that I think the gospel really needs to be resurrection-centric, because the first century certainly was the case. And I might just mention that your book is entitled The Bedrock of Christianity, but the subtitle is The Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection.
Yes.
So let's get to a couple of the chapters, and one of those is Studying History is Time Travel. So that's, of course, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
We'll get into phone booths, which don't exist anymore, but it's still fun.
I love your line there. You talk about a phone booth, and you say, okay, if you're a young person, don't know what a phone booth is, Google it. Of course,
But it's amazing that the new Bill and Ted movie, they're actually filming it right now. So I didn't even plan that. They planned that movie right when my book came out. So they're actually doing a new movie with Bill and Ted's.
We'll have to go watch it for sure. Let's, if we can, then get into this, because what you're trying to do is help us understand the chronology. Jesus is born, Jesus dies, he rose from the dead, and then we move almost immediately into all sorts of different events, some traditions, some hymns, the early letters. Talk about that if you could.
Yeah, so a lot of people, when you think about the sources for Jesus, they automatically just think the Gospels. They think that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our sources and earliest sources for Jesus, but that's just not true. They are excellent and an embarrassment of riches of sources for Jesus, and they are definitely reliable, and I hope to, as I said, write a book about the reliability of the Gospels and get into that debate later on. But actually earlier than the Gospels, we have even 10 to 15 years earlier than probably when Mark was written, we have Paul's letters already being written. And Paul is citing sayings of Jesus, deeds of Jesus. He's citing creeds and hymns about Jesus, about him being God, about him being a part of the creation of the world. And this particular creed that I focus on, that really is the bedrock source of all the bedrock facts, I think, that have to do with the resurrection, and that's in 1 Corinthians 15. So when you look at it on a chronological basis, you have Jesus' death sometime in the early 30s. You have the early creedal traditions that begin within 5 to 10 years after that Paul is quoting in his letters. And then you have Paul's letters in the 50s A.D., the earliest letters. And then you have the Gospels, which I would date beginning in the 60s, and John maybe by 90. But even in the liberal dating, you're looking at the Gospels in the 70s and the 80s. So.
And again, that's one of the things that I think is very striking. And we've mentioned that once or twice on that. But this whole chapter really takes you back to 1 Corinthians 15,
yes,
which also takes you to chapter 2, the bedrock eyewitness. And that's the Apostle Paul. Talk about that, because that's, in a sense, a different way to look at it, since most people want to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yes. But you start, in the sense, looking at Paul because 1 Corinthians 15 is earlier. Explain that.
And I would say Matthew's a bedrock eyewitness. I would say John's a bedrock eyewitness. I would say Peter, who is behind the Gospel of Mark, is a bedrock eyewitness. I mean, he's Mark's bedrock eyewitness. But the way I'm using bedrock in this book, though, is where do everyone agree? So we have debates. Ehrman doesn't agree Matthew wrote Matthew. He doesn't think Peter's behind Mark. He doesn't think Luke wrote Luke. He doesn't think John wrote John. But he agrees Paul wrote these early letters. And he agrees that Paul's movements that he mentions, especially at the beginning of Galatians chapter 1 and 2, he talks about how when Christ appeared to him on the Damascus Road, very soon after that, he went to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the chief disciple. He met of Jesus. He met with James, his brother. And it was during that meeting, even Ehrman agrees, that this is probably the most likely place where Paul received a lot of these traditions, especially the 1 Corinthians 15 tradition that mentions Jesus appeared to Peter. Jesus appeared to James. I mean, where would he get that information? Most likely he got it at that meeting when he hung out with Peter for 2 weeks, which is an incredible thing. I mean, you think about the great meetings of church history. I talk about how C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, when they would meet, and the other Inklings would meet regularly and at the pub and share about Lord of the Rings or Narnia, and then these great meetings in church history. Probably the greatest one is our two chief apostles, Peter and Paul, meeting for 2 weeks in Jerusalem. I mean, I like to think that Peter maybe even took them on a trip. I mean, the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, as at least the Catholics believe, took Paul on a tour of Jerusalem to maybe the very spots where Jesus was crucified, where he rose, where Peter denied him 3 times. I mean, this is part of the historical imagination, but what is a bedrock fact is that Peter and Paul spent 2 weeks together in Jerusalem around 37 A.D., which is an incredible thing.
Well, you're mentioning that. One of the things I think is very helpful about your chapter is you give us a chronology. That reminds me of a book that I have in my library by Harold Hohner, The Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ.
And I'm in complete agreement with his chronology.
Yeah, I see that
he
you
was one of my
quote him.
professors.
Yeah, and one of your professors. And some people don't know that sometimes we can pretty much nail down that chronology, because not only did he have degrees from Dallas Seminary, but I think it was at Cambridge where he'd done his doctoral work. And so we can actually not only talk about these individuals, we can pretty much nail down lots of those key dates.
We can.
And so again, for the person that says, well, we really don't know much about Jesus and we really don't know much about the first century, we can give you dates and places and people and bedrock sources, right?
Incredible. And even outside of the New Testament. So we have, I would say, people outside of, everyone would agree that outside of the Bible, we also have people like Josephus, we have people like Tacitus, we have people like Pliny the Younger, we have multiple Roman, Jewish, Greco-Roman sources that also talk about Jesus, that tell us some key things that really just affirm the bedrock facts. We have the bedrock facts just with Paul. With Paul. That's my argument. That if all we had in our New Testament was Paul's early letters, we would have everything we need for life and salvation. We have everything.
But again, good news is we have all sorts of ancient sources that are not Christian and not sympathetic to the gospel whatsoever. They're Roman and Jewish sources and all the rest. But we need to take a break, and so when we come back, we'll continue for just a few more minutes talking about the significance of 1 Corinthians 15, because that's our bedrock source. Yes. Then we're going to get into the crucifixion and the resurrection, and then, of course, afterwards, the appearances, not just to Peter and to 12, but more than 500 to James and Paul, and all the things which we'll be talking about in just a minute. And if you find yourself saying, okay, you've got my interest, this book is coming out. So again, it is The Bedrock of Christianity, The Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection. Dr. Justin Bass is in studio with us, and we have a lot more to cover. Not only the death, but burial, resurrection, and subsequent appearances, which we'll be talking about in just a few moments. If you want to know some more, go to our website, pointofview.net. We have a link to the book so you can order it for yourself or for maybe a skeptic that needs to read this. We'll be back right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Justin Bass. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I suspect most of you just want to sit back, maybe take some notes, go back and listen to this again. As a matter of fact, if you find yourself saying, we went through some of this material too quickly, you can click on that button that says listen and download a podcast, or click on the button that says watch, or just in a few hours it will be up on the YouTube channel, and you might want to send it on to maybe somebody that you're engaged in some kind of conversation or debate. So again, those are opportunities for you to use that. You can also, of course, be listening to it on Facebook Live and leave a comment there. But Justin, before we go any further, let's kind of set forth everything else in the rest of the chapter: crucifixion, resurrection, the appearances, and then something you've really added, the rise of the Nazarenes, you know, the rise of the Jesus cult, as Rodney Stark refers to it.
Yes.
But are there kind of four basic principles that we talk about with the resurrection?
Yeah, so I deal with many bedrock facts, as we talked about with Paul, with his bedrock sources, the creeds, the letters, his movements, how he spent time with Peter. But when we talk about just, if I want to simplify, what are the bedrock facts that deal with the resurrection? Therefore, one is that Christ died. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. No one debates that. No one debates that. Scholars agree on that, like they agree Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, or that the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in AD 70. It's an Archimedean point of history. The second thing is the claim of the resurrection. So I focus on this particular claim that the earliest Jewish Christians made, that Jesus had risen from the dead. They believed that Jesus had begun what Daniel had prophesied in Daniel chapter 12, that this resurrection has begun in the Messiah, Jesus. And this is an absolutely unique claim. So that's the second one. The third one is the appearances. So they also believe that he appeared to them. Multiple individuals and groups, even an enemy, believed that Jesus appeared to them. And then I talk about, as you said, the rise of the Nazarenes. What probably they were called. They were probably called the sect of the Nazarenes. Like there was the sect of the Sadducees, the sect of the Pharisees, the sect of the Essenes. And then there were this Nazarene cult who followed this crucified man named Yeshua. And so how did that movement then go on to triumph over not just the Roman Empire, but the entire world, and is still the largest religion in the world today? And that's a chapter I get into right before the closing chapter, where I try to demonstrate that if you follow these facts where they lead, it should lead you to the feet of the risen Jesus, saying, "My Lord and my God." But I think that's a chapter that's, I think, unique about with books like this, because you don't find a lot of historians and apologists talking about the bedrock movement. And so I think that's a very important point to bring into this discussion.
And again, chapter 7, which I think is one of the contributions. Let's do the others real quickly, though, to get to some of the appearances and the rest. First of all, the crucifixion, something that, again, is very unusual, but you have, for example, even a picture of a bone where this particular nail is driven through. So in some respects, we have not just historical evidence, but even archaeological evidence of a crucifixion, don't we?
That's right. And we didn't have that before 1968. So we had, just written sources. We had Plutarch talking about crucifixion. We had Josephus. We had the New Testament. But we didn't have any actual physical evidence. And then in 1968, we found an ossuary that had this guy named Johannan. An unfortunate end to his life. He clearly was crucified, not nailed in his hands or his wrist. He was probably tied to the stake, but his feet were fastened to the side of the wooden beam. And one of his ankle bones we still have with the nail still in it, because it was bent. And so you can actually, I have a picture in the book, but that's actually my picture, because I looked at it through the glass in the Jerusalem Museum. So if you go to Jerusalem Museum, you can see Johannan's ankle bone with the nail still in it. It's a 7-inch nail, by the way.
Yes. And again, it's gruesome, but it just reminds you of that. Anybody who's seen The Passion of the Christ understands what a crucifixion would look like. But I want to keep it moving, because then immediately you talk about the empty tomb. Now, some people say, well, how do we know it was empty? Well, because the Jews knew it was empty, and that first myth, if you will, the first conspiracy, is actually recorded in the gospel, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. I say it's the first, at least in the New Testament, it's the first proclamation of fake news. So we have this proclamation of fake news that the disciples had stolen the body, and that was the message that they spread. And so, yeah, the reason that they would have to even make up a excuse is that the tomb would have had to have been empty. Now it's important to point out, though, that the empty tomb and the burial are not bedrock facts in the sense that all scholars agree on them.
I understand that.
I think Gary Habermas has shown that it's roughly around 75% of scholars do agree on the burial and the empty tomb. But I didn't include it because it didn't reach that high bar of the 99%. But I do think there is strong evidence, and I think there's every reason to believe that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, and the tomb was found empty on the third day by Mary Magdalene and the other women. Bart Ehrman, by the way, agreed with that, and then he changed his mind not too long ago. So this is a pretty solid fact that we also have, but unfortunately it's not a bedrock fact where it reaches the 99th percentile. It's more debated because it's not expressly mentioned by Paul.
Well, again, let's then go to chapter 5 on the resurrection, because your skeptics will say, well, this is all taken by faith. But the point you're making is that you had a number of messianic pretenders in the past, and yet at the same time, nothing like this. This is making a claim that nobody saw coming, and even on the day of the resurrection of Jesus, you see the women are sort of puzzled, the men are puzzled. This couple on the road to Emmaus, they're not quite understanding it. Then Thomas hears that Jesus has appeared, and says, "Until I see him, I'm not going to believe." So there was this was an unusual claim, was it not?
I think that's one of the points of my second fact about just the claim of the resurrection. It's the unexpectedness of it all.
Yes,
there was just no expectation for Jesus to rise from the dead, for any Messiah to rise from the dead. And that's an amazing thing that we can do, is we can actually look at the history, we can look at the other sources. These movements are talked about in Josephus and other writers, but we know that there were at least 14 other messianic-type movements that were either a little bit before Jesus, during the time of Jesus, or after Jesus. There were roughly 14 other movements that had similar characteristics of the Jesus movement. You had a charismatic leader who made audacious claims, even made miraculous claims, had disciples. What was different about those movements is they ended up fighting against Rome and then getting destroyed. The leader would either get executed, crucified, beheaded. But what's interesting is you look at all those movements, not one of them do the disciples claim that their leader rose from the dead. I mean, when their leader died, they went out and got jobs. I mean, they had to move on and do something else. They did not try to say that their leader rose from the dead. And so why is it that the Jesus movement made this unique, pure innovation claim? Why did they say uniquely that their Messiah had risen from the dead? Especially when all the evidence suggests that they in every way, like you said, the two on the Emmaus Road, the disciples cowering in fear, Good Friday evening, Saturday, even Saturday morning, not believing the women. I mean, the apostles themselves, if we believe the reports in the Gospels, they thought the women were hysterical, that they were insane, that there's no way that this man Jesus appeared to them. Even they didn't believe. The apostles' response to the resurrection claim was, it's nonsense. I mean, that's an incredible thing. And so I think that in every way shows that you have to explain the unexpectedness of this unique idea, this unparalleled idea in history.
One other thing that I think I just mentioned in passing, just the fact that you had the women were the first ones, whether it's Lee Strobel or Gary Habermas or a variety of other people, William Lane Craig, those were not considered reliable witnesses in the first century. And so that, it sense, has kind of a historical authenticity to it as well.
And of course, that's sad. They're just as good an eyewitness. I mean, Mary Magdalene, Bart Ehrman, by the way, agrees Mary Magdalene is the first one that believed that Jesus appeared to her. And that's a solid historical claim that Mary Magdalene believed Jesus appeared to her. I think they are not mentioned. I talk about this with the creed. I think they are not mentioned in this creed. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to the 12. For that very reason, I think it's because they were using this as evidence for the resurrection, as proof. And so to use the claims of women at that time, unfortunately, they were not believed even in the court of law. Josephus mentions this. And if you look at the sermons in Acts, they also, when they mention the appearances, they don't mention the women. And we know Luke, who wrote Acts, also wrote Luke, and he tells us that women were the first to see Jesus. So the fact that they don't mention it in the sermons, they don't mention it in the creeds, I think it's an apologetic reason. It's wrong. I mean, they were just as good of witnesses as the men, but I think that's the reason why the women aren't mentioned in the early creed.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll look at the last two chapters, because, again, according to what the the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians is that Jesus appeared to Peter, the 12, more than 500, James, and of course, Paul himself. And so we'll look at some of the appearances and the claims being made there, and then the whole idea of the rise of this Nazarene cult that then eventually became the triumph of Christianity, if I can paraphrase Rodney Stark, who's been on the program with us. And this is just a fascinating book, which, again, takes the serious look at the historical evidence and really says, what is the bedrock of our Christian faith? And that, of course, is the title of the book, The Bedrock of Christianity, The Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection. So we'll come back and talk about that. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, we've got a perfect link right there on pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to it again, you can click on the button to download a podcast or maybe send it to a skeptical friend. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we are privileged to have in studio with us for a little bit longer Dr. Justin Bass, and we're going to get now to two other chapters, one on the appearances, and that is significant because you are talking about appearances to individuals, then groups of individuals, so that sets aside that this was a hallucination or some kind of desire to believe that Jesus was alive, and I think we've already sort of addressed that anyway. But this whole list of appearances that the Apostle Paul provides in 1 Corinthians 15 really is a very powerful apologetic argument, isn't it?
Very powerful, and I love it because it's actually what Paul was using as an apologetic argument, and we know this because of this point he makes, especially when he mentions the 500. He tells us that more than 500, probably men and women, saw Jesus at one time, and then he makes the point, and this is probably an additional comment by him to the Corinthians that he's writing to, that probably wasn't a part of the creed. He says, many of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, why would he say that? He's saying that because he's saying, hey, Corinthians, take a holiday. Don't go to Disneyland, go over to Jerusalem and meet some of these 500 that are still alive and ask them, what was it like to see the risen Jesus? But he also mentions the three individuals. He mentions Peter, he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, and he mentions himself. And when we look at all the appearances in the New Testament, we only have 4 actual individuals that Jesus appeared to alone reported, and that is Mary Magdalene, Peter, James, and Paul. And so we only get one more of those individual appearances outside the creed. In the creed, we get all the individual appearances except for Mary Magdalene.
And again, you see Paul sometimes saying, as you yourselves know, this was not done in a corner. There's always sort of this appeal to evidence, and that is certainly one of the things that differentiates Christianity from
we can
something
summon
else.
Witnesses. Yeah. Well, here's one. Here's a group. Here's the, we can and that's why it's unlike, I talk about this in the book, it's unlike any, if it was hallucinations, it's unlike any hallucinations we have on record. That's right. Because you don't have these kind of hallucinations where multiple individuals, multiple groups, especially at the level of 500. And especially by an enemy. Dale Allison, this excellent New Testament scholar, he wrote a book called Resurrecting Jesus, and he really surveys the literature on bereavement, people who claim to have seen someone after they died, and all these claims through the literature, and he shows how really the Christian claims is absolutely unique when it comes to what they claimed about the risen Jesus.
I love the part about John Wesley in his commentary in the New Testament when he's talking about those who are still alive, some have fallen asleep, a glorious and incontestable proof. The greater part remain alive. Yes. But I want to leave enough time for what I think is one of the most unique contributions from you, and that is the rise of the Nazarenes, the last chapter before the conclusion, because this also illustrates this, because there were people that were willing to die, martyrs' deaths for this. Yes. There were people that were willing to risk their own lives as a plague would break out or as babies were being abandoned on the streets. And so in some respects, the pagans looking at this saying, I wouldn't do that. And this whole idea of hospitals, compassion, even social action all came about because of those individuals who demonstrated that they truly did believe what the scriptures actually say, that Jesus rose from the dead.
That's right. And also even their intellectual pursuit of wisdom. I mean, you got some of the greatest minds, people like Origen, people like Augustine, people like Jerome and John Chrysostom. When you look at some of the greatest minds, I mean, this led many of the pagans who were also pursuing philosophy and wisdom to want to come over to the Christian faith. But yeah, I wanted to focus on this rise of the Christian movement and how it's gone on to triumph over the world, because I challenge the skeptic in the book, and I challenge any skeptic listening. Think about if Jesus did rise from the dead, what would we expect? If he is alive, if he would not just be changing the lives of the apostles in the first century Jerusalem, as he clearly did. He would also be changing lives all over the world. And his movement wouldn't have just stayed in one part of the world, like, for example, Jainism, the religion Jainism, has stayed in India. I mean, all its history. Hinduism, even, it's been around 3,000 years, but for some reason, it's not been able to go past the borders of India. I mean, Hinduism has pretty much, in the 99th percentile, been in India. Now, if the gods of Hinduism were true, you'd expect them to reach out to someone beyond India, wouldn't you? And so in the same way, you can apply this to Christianity. Jesus said the gospel will go to all nations. And what are we seeing when we look at, when we have 2,000-year hindsight? We see how the gospel has gone to just about every nation on the planet. The Bible translated in just about every language spoken is saying the Lord's Prayer, is praising Jesus, is worshiping him, like we read in the book of Revelation. And so you have to account for this. How is it that this small movement, worshiping a crucified man, how did that go on to dominate the entire world and influence culture in every way? I mean, the greatest literature, the greatest music, the greatest paintings, the greatest architecture, all of this was inspired by Jesus, by this one man, this Nazarene. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, it looks like the greatest movement that ever existed and the most dominating movement that's ever existed came out of Nazareth. So that's what I say. So how do you explain the rise of this bedrock movement and its dominance throughout the world. I think if Jesus rose from the dead, it's exactly what we would expect is what has happened over the last 2,000 years.
And again, you say, just talk about all the people through the past 2,000 years who have been transformed by the risen Christ.
And individually.
And you say, I wish I could survey all the art and literature and philosophy and music and even films. Of course, you give examples for each one of those. And I think that's a very powerful argument. And I have a slide when I do these presentations on that, because I still think it's a powerful part of that argument as well. But
and I've done some lectures and sermons based on what I'm talking about in this book, and I have an ending where I go through just about every continent over the last 2,000 years. People, not just as anybody, but people who are some of the most famous people in history who were transformed by the resurrected Christ. They believed that he appeared to them either in a dream or a voice. This includes Martin Luther King Jr. Most people don't know that Martin Luther King Jr., he almost quit his ministry. He almost quit what he was doing for civil rights because of the threats to his family. He was on his knees praying to God, and he believed he heard the voice of Jesus. He tells the story in his autobiography, and it was the voice of Jesus that gave him the courage and the ability to fight on, and he said, I was ready to face anything after I heard the voice of Jesus. And so most people don't know that. Most people don't know, why does everyone love Martin Luther King? What gave him such courage and boldness? Ultimately, it was the voice of Jesus. It was the resurrected Christ, and he's just one of billions that have been transformed by this crucified man.
Your last chapter, of course, also talks about miracles, and of course, our skeptical friends wouldn't accept that. But whether it's fulfilled prophecy, messianic prophecy, miracles, of course, the most significant miracle, the resurrection. But again, you come back to those bedrock facts, and this is the kind of book that I would suggest that if you are maybe having some questions about what we can really see as the bedrock of our faith, this would be helpful for a Christian. But this is the kind of book I'd really want to hand to a non-Christian friend, don't you think?
Yeah, I'm hoping that I want to equip the Christian in the bedrock the bedrock facts and the bedrock sources, and really the bedrock of their faith. I want their understanding and belief in the resurrection to go down a few floors in their hearts, as deep as it'll go. But I also want to challenge the skeptic. I use the image from Hamlet, the skeptical Horatio, and Hamlet's great line that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And so you need to, if your philosophy doesn't include miracles, if your worldview doesn't include miracles, you need a greater philosophy. You need a greater worldview. And so we need to investigate each miracle. There's a ton of miracles that are tons of miracle claims that I don't believe happened because there's no evidence. There's just no evidence. But this has solid, robust, incredible evidence when it comes to the resurrection, and I want to lay that out for the world.
Well, I think this book would really encourage a Christian. It would be really helpful for somebody that's got some doubts, but it would also be something I'd love to hand to my non-Christian skeptical friends, because it talks about the bedrock of Christianity. And so, Dr. Justin Bass, it's just been great to have you in studio, and I know you'll be going back to Jordan, but we got to figure this out to get you back here, or else do it by phone, because you bring a lot to the table. And so thank you for being with us today here on Point of View. We're going to take a break, but if you find yourself saying, I'm interested in the book, again, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, and it's Lexham Press, but we have a link to you and a link for you on the website, pointofview.net. And that is a way in which you can get a copy of the book, and I think you will really benefit from it. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. The next couple hours, we're going to be covering a number of different topics. Of course, we will come back to later this hour to the issue of the coronavirus, because the Senate now has actually passed a $2.2 trillion relief package, which will now go to the House of Representatives and hopefully will be passed on Friday. That will provide needed relief to not only individuals like yourself, but also businesses. We also have information about a Harvard study now that has concluded that maybe the fatality rate is much lower for the coronavirus than the World Health Organization might have thought. But that doesn't make us feel terrific, because in light of the fact that, as we will also talk about, hospital capacity has in some places already crossed the tipping point. So we're going to be talking about that. And if that weren't enough, of course, a little bit later, we'll also talk about these indictments against Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and a number of other places about drug trafficking. So those will be topics we will indeed get to in the future. But I also like to take our attention away from this from time to time, because there's so many other stories that you need to hear. And one of those we wanted to focus on for a few minutes is the story of Jim Domen, an individual who I never really thought that he would enter into the homosexual lifestyle, but did. But in 2002, in some respects, heard God's voice calling him back to him, and then enrolled in seminary at Azusa Pacific University. After graduation, also became a pastor, but also met his wife, has 3 children, and really has had a desire to tell his story and to really reach out to those who might be caught into the homosexual lifestyle. So, Pastor Domen, it's just great to have you on the program here at Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be on the air with you. Thanks for having me today.
Let's, if we can, tell your story, because as I understand, you grew up in a Christian home, became a Christian, accepted Christ at the age of 7, but somewhere along the line you found yourself in the homosexual lifestyle. Tell us more, if you might.
Yeah, in junior high, I realized I was attracted to my own gender. I thought I was a homosexual, prayed and read the Word, and God didn't change me, and I didn't know what to do. So fast forward a little bit, I had saved myself for marriage. I wanted to get married and have a family, but at age 23, I didn't think that would ever be possible, being attracted to men. So I entered the homosexual lifestyle.
And one of the things I might just mention is we have a link to your website where people can watch, as I have, the video that is actually put together by CBN, and that will, of course, tell the story of you. And then we have quite a number of other stories there as well. And then, of course, pictures of your wife and of your marriage and family and all of the rest. But in some respects, you, as I've said so often, had to sometimes hit bottom before you could look up. And that takes us to June 8th, 2002. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, well done, Kerby. Thank you. So I was in the lifestyle for 5 years, and June 8th, 2002, God literally took everything from me overnight. My partner took me off our bank accounts, so I had no access to cash, and was kicked out of my home and literally found myself on the street with no place to go. And when all this happened, I had a gay couple had said, hey, you could stay in one of our apartment buildings, one of our apartments, for 30 days. You'll have to pay after 30 days, but at least you've got a place to go. And that night, June 8, 2002, I looked up at the ceiling and I said, God, I'm yours again. And that next day, when I walked out to my car on a public street, $5 was laying on the sidewalk.
Wow.
And I picked that up, and that was my first meal. I went to Denny's, Grand Slam breakfast for $2.99. And God, that was kind of the first miracle of many to come where God intervened and helped me on this path of restoration.
Let's talk about that restoration, because that restoration took place while you were also thinking, maybe I need to go to seminary. The chronology is kind of intriguing, the way this is played out. So tell us that story.
Yeah, so God, there was still a part of me that wanted, as soon as I got back on my feet, I was going to go back into the homosexual lifestyle. There was this war raging for my soul, and I ended up back at home with Mom and Dad. They said, "Come live with us. We'd love to have you." I'm a grown man, already had my business and a home, but they said, "Let us help you. Let us just kind of help you get you on your feet." And during that time, the relationship with my dad and parents was restored. I was so hungry for Jesus. I was going to 3 churches, 3 different men's Bible studies,
Wow.
just really being cleansed by the Word of God. And as this journey continued, God just really began healing in me. And a mentor said, a pastor friend said, "Why don't you go to seminary?" And I said, "Why would I want to do that? I want nothing to do with the church. I want to be Jesus with skin on to a lost and dying world." And my view, the church wasn't that to the homosexual community, but I wanted to be real. I wanted to tell people about the power of redemption, the power of Jesus' blood, and how he cleanses us and restores our broken sexual lives. And what the Lord kind of showed me through this mentor was, Jim, if you go to seminary, think about this. You could help tell your story, better equip the church how to respond to these issues. And it was almost like a prophetic word. So I said, that makes sense. I can multiply my impact if I'm helping equip the church to deal with LGBTQ issues, amongst other government issues.
And again, one of the things that you encourage people to do is go to your website, which we have, jimdomen.com, Transforming California for Christ. And again, you can hear a little bit more of that story. And just before we take a break, let's tell one other aspect of that story, because you get your degree from Azusa Pacific, but you didn't get your diploma, and that's how you met your wife. Tell that story.
So I'm not a writer. I'm more of a doer. And I finished my Master of Divinity. I was the senior speaker. I walked with my class in 2006, but I put off writing my thesis. And I had to write that before actually getting my diploma. So I go to Israel with one of my profs, and he goes, Jim, you really need to finish this. So I finally sit down, take the time, finish my thesis, submit it, and then now, I got an A and was able to actually get my diploma. But I'm working on a book called A Divine Mistake. It's part of my life story and how I met my beautiful bride, God's gift from heaven, as my dad calls her. The university somehow mailed my diploma to the wrong address. It was returned to the school. I go to the school to pick it up. I got a phone call. They said, "Hey, we've got your diploma." I said, "Don't mail it. I worked really hard on that. I'll drive up on my lunch break and come get it." I was on staff at a church at the time, and as I get to the front office, this beautiful girl behind the desk says, "Can I help you?" I explained to her what happened. She goes, "Oh, your diploma's right here. Why don't you take it out and read it?" What I didn't know is now my wife, Amanda, she didn't even work in the front office. She was the executive director of the Graduate Client Services Department at APU. Her team dealt with the graduate students. She just happened to be behind the desk when I walked in the door and obviously served me like she would any other client.
A divine appointment. Let me take a break, and we'll talk a bit more about that, and also the ministry that you have developed. So we'll talk about this with Jim Domen right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I'm America is a divided country. Os Guinness, in his book Last Call for Liberty, argues that the American Republic is suffering its greatest crisis since the Civil War, and he believes the root of this disagreement is two different definitions of freedom. One view of freedom is embodied in 1776 in the American Revolution. The other view arose in 1789 in the French Revolution. The first can be found in the Declaration of Independence that owes its formulation to the Protestant Reformation, and even earlier in the book of Exodus. The second can be found in France's Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité that ended in the Reign of Terror, to which we can add Marx's triumph of the proletariat and in the policies of Stalin and Mao Zedong. His book asks 10 questions that make up the chapters of the book. When he was in the studio with me talking about his book, I mentioned that few Americans could answer the questions in the affirmative. He asked, "Do you know where your freedom comes from?" Even fewer could offer good answers to questions like, "How do you plan to sustain freedom?" He also addresses the question, "How will you make the world safe for diversity?" Here we have two starkly different visions of public life. On the one side are proponents of what Richard John Neuhaus called a naked public square that would exclude religion and religious expressions from public life. Proponents of a sacred public square would give preference to one religion. He advocates for a civil public square where citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. This book provides wise counsel on how Christians can be at the forefront of bringing America back to its proper understanding of freedom. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jim Domen with us for a little bit longer, and if you'd like to know more about his ministry, we can encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, or go directly to jimdomen.com, but we have a link there. You'll find out more about transforming California for Christ. He's a pastor, a husband, a father, and an Ironman. I looked at some of the pictures of the number of times you've run marathons and swam and everything else. But again, we heard the story about you and Amanda, but I thought I'd like to leave a little bit of time for you to talk about what you are trying to do through Church United and transforming California for Christ. We have a number of listeners in California that I think may or may not be familiar with what you're doing there. And of course, we have listeners all over the country that could benefit from that. So Jim, talk about this, because you really had a heart to take your message and this idea of transformation first to your state and then around the country.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity for me to share about churchunited.com. Church United was founded primarily, God's given me a passion for his kingdom and government, and typically church and government don't play real well together. And as I've wrestled with that going through seminary, we don't really, in seminary, don't talk about the church's role in government. I just saw this huge void, this huge need of how can we better connect where church has pastors, leaders, have a voice in government. And if we don't have godly men and women in places of authority, how do we pray for them? How do we interact with them and really kind of advance the kingdom through government? And God kind of gave me this vision for Church United, and Church United's role was to serve California pastors. And really, as we do that, they get engaged, activated in government. And we're watching this network of pastors across California change and transform the state from evil to good.
So again, you have briefings, you have tours, you have a variety of other things. So talk about that for just a minute, because certainly for our California listeners, they can benefit. But I would also encourage our listeners in 42 other states to consider doing something similar as well, because oftentimes pastors have this hesitation. Jim, you certainly are aware of this, that maybe I shouldn't really address those kinds of issues. So talk about the kinds of briefings and tours that you have that are already available to some of our listeners.
So this is really, I'll tell you what's happening, Kerby. In California, we've had such a dramatic effect. Pastors in other states are asking me, Jim, how can we do Church United in our state? And the impact we've had globally, specifically in Taiwan and many other countries, pastors from other countries are saying, Jim, how do we do Church United in our country? Let me just kind of focus back here in California and just kind of what I believe God is trying to do and grow globally. But we'll start with California and go across our own nation. So an Awakening Tour, Church United sponsors pastors, no cost to them or the church, to take them to Washington, D.C. or California's capital, Sacramento, and we set up appointments with elected officials for them to pray, for them to share Jesus with, for them to hear what's happening at a national and state level. And I'm going to give you one important component that Church United does not do. We never tell pastors what to do or what to say. And really, we allow the Holy Spirit to move in and through them. It's like taking them on a short-term missions trip, but instead of going to another country, we're going to, or another place in the United States, we're taking them to our nation's capital or their state capital and letting them engage. We'll have different speakers, from elected officials to topics like immigration, racism, economics, and whatever issues are affecting the church and culture. We want to bring speakers that can equip and provide the best resources and information to our pastors. So what happens, they come back from an Awakening Tour and they get activated. And we've seen pastors stop marijuana from being sold in their cities. We've seen pastors come together to stop aborted babies in their parks from being sold not only in Orange County, but the Orange County DA shut the business down and banned these people from doing business in the state of California. We've seen pastors get threatened or churches and pastors threatened by cities saying, we're going to kick you out of your facilities so we can sell pot. And there's so many different impact stories where pastors have engaged because they've got activated through Church United to transform their city, their community for Christ.
And part of that is just the need for information. We have actually many times talked with George Barna, Gary Frazier, and others, in which they did a survey of various church members and said, would you like to hear messages from the pulpit by pastors on some of these issues? And they go through some of the typical issues that we address every day here on Point of View. And they all say yes. And then they ask pastors, does the Bible speak to these issues? And again, I can go through the long list of issues, but the kinds of things we talk about. And they say, yeah, the Bible does speak to that. And then we ask, do you actually address those issues in the pulpit? That's when they stop answering the question or start looking at their shoes, because the concern is sometimes, well, okay, maybe the Bible does have something to say about, I don't know, immigration, trade. Of course, we know the Bible probably has something to say about abortion, homosexuality, but I don't really know what to say. And so you're providing that link so that if a pastor has a desire to address those issues from a biblical point of view, you've given them information so that they can make a difference in their own community.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought the resource and information topic up, because I'll tell you why I think Church United is uniquely different from just how we're serving the need, is we're doing this relationally. It's heart to heart, and pastors feel isolated and alone. But when they come together as one and they go, wait a minute, I didn't know you. Oh, your church is down the street from me, or you're in the next city over, and we unify as the body of Christ and come together, they see the power that has. I mean, Jesus talking about it with the Father in Scripture in John 17, and how it brings the body together, and they see this relational component, And then they feel empowered. One, they're not alone, that there's other pastors, other churches from different denominations that will stand. And they're now equipped and feel more, I'll say, emboldened to talk about these topics. If it's a life issue, if it's abortion, if it's homosexuality, whatever it might be, they're not alone. They're banding together and preaching boldly like they've never done before on these topics.
Just before we run out of time, let's mention that if somebody would love to hear your testimony, maybe have you come and speak, of course, we have a link to jimdomen.com, but we also encourage everyone to consider what they might do to get information from churchunited.com, because that's a way, especially for our listeners in the state of California, that you can get involved instantaneously. There are networks all around this state, and so you can get involved there. But for those of you in other states that might say, we need something like this here, they can contact you and find out how they could set up something similar in their state, couldn't they?
Absolutely. I've got a list of states, about 10 states right now, where I've got people that said, hey, Jim, can we do Church United in our state? And we're actually working on a blueprint with some business leaders, how we can best replicate Church United and try to have Church United around in every state in our country.
And so, again, there's a contact point where you can give your name, email, some other material. That will go to, of course, where Church United is in Newport Beach, California. There's also an e-newsletter sign-up, which would be helpful just to know of some of these topics and issues and those kinds of things. And so I wanted people, first of all, to know your testimony. It is an incredible testimony, and we, again, encourage people to go to the website, jimdomen.com. That first video there is very well produced, obviously, by our friends at CBN 700 Club, and tells the story, which is something that talks about freedom in Christ. And then, of course, Church United is another aspect of that, and we have that link there as well. So, Jim, it's just been great to have you on the program, and I'm just thrilled that not only do you have a great testimony to share, but you're working to try to transform your community for Christ. And so it's just been great to have you on Point of View, and love to do it again sometime in the future.
Kirby, Lord bless you and bless all your listeners, and thank you for having me on today. God bless you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, for just a minute, I thought I'd talk about a film that you can see, Home Sweet Home. We'll just talk about that for a little bit with one of the actresses, Natasha Bure, and then we'll get into the coronavirus. And just as a program note, let me mention that in the second hour, we'll continue our conversation about this, but we are going to focus in the second hour on the economic issues related to that. And Stephen Moore will be joining us. He, of course, is a contributor to Freedom Works. You might remember him as an individual that has been on a variety of different programs over the years, was on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and has been involved in one way or the other with the Trump campaign and the Trump administration, because we want to talk about what were some of the successes, economic successes, and then where we are right now, and will we recover from this economically? So we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's spend some time, if we can, talking about some of the costs that are going to be incurred in terms of trying to deal with the coronavirus. And that is a bill that has now passed the U.S. Senate unanimously, interestingly enough, an estimated $2.2 trillion. Sent to now the House of Representatives. The idea is that the leaders hope that it will pass on Friday, so we'll be following that, of course, on our Friday weekend edition. And then, of course, the plan hopefully will then speed payments to Americans within about 3 weeks. And that, of course, depends on what happens in the Democratic-controlled House. And you might say, well, that should be a done deal. Yeah, it was thought to be a done deal about this time last week, even thought to be pretty much a done deal on Saturday. And all of that blew up, so we'll see where that goes in the future. So that is kind of where we are right now. But again, the price tag, $2.2 trillion. Let's again stipulate that, of course, human life is valuable, but also the economy is being devastated by some of these actions being taken. And, of course, we are going to be facing some very significant crises, as I alluded to at the top of the program here, in terms of hospital capacity, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I think the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, if nothing else, looks at this with a little more of a skeptical eye. And I think that's necessary right now. The editors put it this way: Congress rarely does anything that isn't messy. So let's stipulate that a $2 trillion bill written on the fly in a week will be loaded with waste and lifetime supply of unintended consequences. You think? Americans will pay for this for decades, they say. The consolation is the Senate bill that was moving to a vote, if anything, includes money to keep workers and businesses afloat during the national economic shutdown and perhaps avoid a depression. The virus rescue, they say, though, shouldn't cost this much. The bill includes $250 billion for $1,200 payments to Americans, whether or not they're affected by the virus. Now, think about that for a minute, whether you're affected by it or not. The cash will do little or nothing to help an economy closed by government fiat. The bill also pluses up unemployment insurance beyond 100% of wages, an incentive not to return to work if you're laid off. And the point they make here is the Republicans were scrambling to fix that provision on Wednesday. And again, credit to, all sorts of individuals like that have been trying to do so. And I'll maybe say more about that a little bit later. The bill spends, again, about $150 billion to pad the mismanaged budgets of state and local governments. In, they say, like in Albany and Sacramento. They're talking about the state budgets of California and New York. And elsewhere, no strings attached to oversight. And, of course, this one everybody's been upset about. Speaker Nancy Pelosi managed to earmark $25 million on so-called virus relief for Washington's Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. As much as that bothers me, it's only $25 million, only $25 million out of $2.2 trillion. It is a good illustration of the kinds of things, these various ornaments that are put on the Christmas tree. And as much as it bothers me to spend $25 million on the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, where I have been before, I actually got to sit in a presidential box once there. Of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with the virus crisis, and just an illustration of all sorts of other things that are no doubt lurking in this very quickly written bill with all sorts of additional material in it that has nothing to do with the coronavirus. But nevertheless, they go on to say that Congress did what it always does and used a crisis to pack the bill with spending the members couldn't get through on a normal budget. And they go on to say that the journalists will probably need weeks to cull through the pages and figure out what it all really means. And so that is certainly an issue. And if you'd like to read this for yourself, let me mention that is the first article we've posted here, The High Price of the coronavirus. Actually, again, the high price is the Fed gets money to save the economy, but Pelosi's price is steep. And there's just one illustration of that. I could give you many more. But if nothing else, the editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way. They said the good news is the bill provides urgent money for emergency medical supplies to hospitals, to make ventilators for virus patients and protection equipment for doctors and nurses, and to support researchers looking for new therapies and perhaps a vaccine. This is the proper role of government given the extraordinary health emergency. Call me skeptical, but I still suspect that the very significant advances in vaccine production and even therapy probably are going to still take place in the private sector, but let's give government its due to try to address this as much as possible. A little bit later, when we have a chance to talk with Stephen Moore, we'll get into maybe some of this because they argue that the bill provides some crucial liquidity to businesses that have had their revenue reduced or eliminated by national lockdown. This is not a problem caused by business or reckless CEOs. This is a liquidity crisis caused by the government strategy to reduce the spread of the virus and loss of life. And that is a distinction I will make that will be obliterated come as we get closer to the political campaign, in which they'll say, well, you Republicans voted for a stimulus and a bailout. Well, yes, because this one had nothing to do with mistakes that were made, say, in the banking industry or the housing industry, like in 2008. This had to do with the government actually shutting this particular government structure down. And so individuals who may have been acting responsibly are maybe going to go bankrupt. Other individuals that have access to some of this government largesse, pigs at the trough, as some people like to say, will benefit even though maybe they don't deserve so. And, of course, I will agree with the editors here that as much as you and I that are listening to this particular program right now would love to get $1,200 in a check from the government, how much were you affected by this? How much were others affected by this? And given the fact that there's not much of a means test other than if you make more than a certain amount, $75,000 per individual, $150,000 for a couple, which then phases it out, you would still receive that, whether you have been economically harmed or not, I think is of real concern and something that we will try to address in the future. So one of the articles that I've posted here, and we'll probably get back to it a little bit later in the next hour, is on the high price of the coronavirus relief. But before I take a break, I want to mention the other article that we have. Actually, I should mention we have one on China, but I want to stay on coronavirus for a minute. We'll get to the China one in just a minute. And that is a Harvard study, which interestingly enough is finding that the fatality rate is far lower than the World Health Organization suggests. And that is, you've had a couple of these published articles now, which were suggestive of the fact that when we look at this, it is possible that the coronavirus mortality rate might be a kind of 1.4%. And that's uniform. Now, when you recognize that that number is going to be higher for older people than younger, first of all, the 1.4% is substantially lower than the 3.4% that was used by the World Health Organization, and again, is even maybe artificially high because it includes certain individuals who might have other kinds of underlying medical issues. And as I understand it right now, not trying to be cavalier or crass at all, but if a person has a coronary failure, but they also posted positive for the coronavirus, even if they had a heart attack, that would be listed as a death due to the coronavirus, but that person might have died from a heart attack even if they had not contracted the virus. So sometimes those numbers get to be a little bit higher as well. And so, if nothing else, we are seeing what many people began to suspect, and that is the fact that those numbers could be even lower. And when we come back from the break, I'll be glad to give some examples of that, because when we look at different countries, we see some different evidence of that as well. And that comes from a piece of research that's just been posted within the last couple of hours. So there are some hopeful signs in terms of that. But also, when we come back from the break, I want to spend just a minute or two talking about the legacy of lies from China. Very good piece put together by our friend Tony Perkins, and we'll talk about that. And if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to spend some time talking with an actress in this new film, Home Sweet Home. We have not connected with her, and if we do, that'll be fine. If not, next hour we have Stephen Moore with us to talk about the economic consequences of all this right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Next hour, we will have an open line, so I hope that some of you might have some comments or questions, and we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. And, of course, we'll be, before the end of the next hour, spend some time talking with Stephen Moore and looking at some of the economic consequences. Really what I want to do is twofold. Number one, when I have him, I want to talk about what were some of the successes, some of the economic successes of the Trump administration, because unfortunately people's memory is not very good. And by the time we get to the presidential campaign unfolding in September and October, I think a lot of people will forget where we used to be before this virus took hold. And so I want to have him talk about that and delineate that for a few minutes, just so we'll have some audio to remind people of how good it was before this virus crisis hit. And then I want to talk about, okay, $2.2 trillion. How much of this is really going to make a difference? And given the fact that the assumption has always been that we would have a V, that is, the economy would drop, but then eventually it would robustly come back. Now people are saying it's going to look like more of an extended or a poorly drawn U. I think all of us believe that it will come back because the economic factors in this country are very good. But when you tell so many people to stay at home and not work, and when you tell individuals there's so much uncertainty, they then decide to sell their stock. They decide, for example, not to buy any products other than toilet paper, it appears. So what about those issues? So those are some topics we will get into with him, but I'd also love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. And let me, just before I take some phone calls, just finish my point, first of all, on this Harvard study and then some of these follow-up studies, because according to the study that was in Nature Medicine, the estimates are maybe the, if you will, the fatality rate or mortality rate is 1.4%, which is very different than the number that the World Health Organization used of 3.4%. But it's even more significant than that. An article that came out 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal by the two researchers kind of working in this field, they are professors of medicine at Stanford University, said that when we look at that fatality rate, that's usually at 2 to 4%, they said they believe that the estimate is deeply flawed. The true fatality rate is the portion of those infected who die, not the deaths from identified positive rates. Of course, we would accept that. The latter rate, they said, is misleading because of what is called selection bias in testing. And they use two examples, and then let me take some phone calls. The first is they point out that, remember when we had the breakout in Wuhan, China, there was an attempt to then very quickly remove people from that area. Let's talk about the people that came into the United States. But you can, again, recognize that when those planes landed, the passengers all were tested for COVID-19 in quarantine. And after 14 days, the percentage who tested positive, 0.9%, less than 1%. Let's go to Italy. You have this northern eastern town near the province of Padua. And again, when they look at the testing that took place and compared it to all those individuals, they estimate that since Italy's fatality rate of 8% is estimated on the confirmed cases, once you run the numbers, the real fatality rate would be closer to 0.06%. So again, the mortality rate much lower than we have been hearing from the World Health Organization. But let's open up the phones, give some of you a chance to ask a question. If we don't get to your question this hour, we will certainly be available for questions in the next hour. We'll head to Georgia first, and we'll talk to John. Thank you for calling today.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon. I've got a question. I saw something on Facebook about Senator Kennedy and some of the other Republicans that added a gun safety thing in the bill, and I don't know if you can trust what's on Facebook anymore, so that's my question is there any truth to the fact that they're trying to raise taxes on the purchases of ammo and guns and ban some guns? I think if there's any truth?
Yeah, and I'll try to figure out if that is a rider on the bill, but let me give you the broader context. We have a number of states, not yours, but if you go north from where you are, Pennsylvania, if you go to the Midwest, there's at least one city I've identified and a couple other that have actually banned the purchases of firearms. So I think there was actually an attempt to do just the opposite and just argue that just because we have a virus crisis, that shouldn't all of a sudden eliminate our Second Amendment rights. But let me check on that because it's possible that some other riders or amendments have slipped into that. But before I would accept that posting on Facebook, I'll see what we can find out. Is that fair?
Spirit. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you bringing that up because one of the things that we have seen is that in addition to the shelter in place and lockdown, I mentioned too, because we have listeners both in Pennsylvania and Illinois. I could mention other states, but certainly we have listeners there. You've seen some of that. And of course, the other day I mentioned the Pennsylvania case where there was an attempt to try to postpone that, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, if I remember correctly, I've got this on another stack of pieces of paper here, simply let that ban go ahead. So I think that's really what we're talking about there, but we will see where that might actually take place. And of course, that is one of those issues we will be addressing here on Point of View. When we come back from the break, though, I will spend some time also talking about China, what many people have referred to as China's legacy of lies. Yesterday, if you listened to the Point of View program, I did point out the fact that there is an attempt to bring a class action suit against China. So that is the case, and so we'll talk about that. Let me just, before I take a break, acknowledge something else, which is really amazing. Didn't see this one coming down the pike at all. But it turns out that now there are indictments being brought against Venezuela in general, but Nicolas Maduro in particular, because these are what are called drug trafficking indictments. And so this is actually a charge that this individual, the, quote, president, and I put that in quotes, the leader in Venezuela, I think the illegitimately elected leader Maduro, has been accused of turning the world's oil richest nation into a land of course, starving children and all sorts of corruption, but also, in a sense, has turned it over to what could be considered drug trafficking. And so that has been kind of an interesting action that has taken place. And Tom Rogan, writing today, said, if nothing else, this closes the door to any compromise with Venezuela. You know, the argument has always been before that, well, maybe we can work out something so that we can get the duly elected, the actual legitimate president to go in and take control of Venezuela and move it away from this socialist disaster into something that would benefit from the fact that there are so many ways in which the people in Venezuela could be prospering right now because of the oil revenues. And more importantly, the argument is maybe we can just find our peace with this. Well, now we're starting to see that it is quite possible that drug trafficking, even the development of kind of a global drug trade has developed out of that country. And so, as surprising as that might have been to some of us, I certainly didn't see it coming. Those are the indictments brought on Venezuela. So we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But most importantly, I want to come back and talk about this whole legacy of lies in China. This is a very good piece by Tony Perkins. I thought I would read it for you, and we'll come back and talk about that. It's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back right after the break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
So we're going to spend some time looking at the coronavirus once again, and then we're going to be talking with our friend Stephen Moore, again, trying to get some perspective on the economic consequences of some of the action that has been taking place, whether it is a lockdown, whether it is a desire to have shelter in place, social distancing, the effect that it's having on business, and whether or not this $2.2 trillion bill would actually make a difference. And one of the things I wanted to just real quickly try to address is John was asking about what might be in the bill that I can't find at the moment, but I did mention just something in passing, and it's worth mentioning again that there is a real ongoing debate right now about guns and the coronavirus, as you might imagine. Let's look at it from a more kind of progressive point of view. One of the op-eds that appeared in the New York Times by Dan Levin really wonders whether gun shops are essential business. The way he says it is groceries, gasoline, medical care, marijuana, in some places, all have been designed and designated as essential to society. But what about guns? And he points out that firearm and ammunition sales have soared in recent weeks, so clearly some Americans want them. A gun industry association is lobbying federal and state governments to categorize firearm manufacturers and dealers as critical infrastructure, but we'll see where that goes. But basically his argument is this makes no sense, that guns will make us any safer. That was one of the arguments, as a matter of fact, by one of the individuals who is the president of Everytown for Gun Safety. On the other hand, got a piece that came out that actually says that this would be helpful if indeed people are trying to break into your house, and talks about one of the video footages of recording officers slamming a 67-year-old woman to the ground in her own and breaking her shoulder for illegally owning a firearm in New Orleans. And so you've had some of these declarations. You have, for example, the mayor of Champaign, Illinois, for example, that says that this is giving her justification to ban the sale of firearms and ammunition. I mentioned Pennsylvania just a minute ago. This is where you had the governor there ordered all non-essential businesses, which they would include gun stores, to close, which prompted a lawsuit from the Firearms Policy Coalition because they had noticed, of course, that gun sales in Pennsylvania has skyrocketed. And in some respects, the background check system actually crashed because so many people are purchasing firearms. So that's just a little bit of a look on it. Is there something in the coronavirus bill? Probably could be. We will see where that takes us. There was a desire on the part of Mitch McConnell in order to get a vote to leave some of the questionable issues in the bill in order to get it passed by the Senate. Now it goes to the House, and I suspect we're going to, for the next few days and weeks, find all sorts of things that are in that bill that shouldn't be there, and I've already sort of given you a little bit of a look at that anyway. So that is just a quick answer to a question that we will try to get you some more research on as we find out. Let's, if we can, go to one of the other articles that I've posted on the website. This comes from Tony Perkins at Family Research Council. He calls it Cause and Infect. China's legacy of lies. And he says, some people won't know the name of Li Wenliang, but nor will they have a chance to thank him. He died in China on February 7th of the plague that he warned was coming. The ophthalmologist was just 34 years of age when his heart stopped, a husband and a father with another baby on the way. We have, of course, one reporter saying he wasn't an idealistic whistleblower. He was not a dissident. He wasn't even political. He was simply a doctor doing his job. And for that, of course, Tony Perkins says China silenced him permanently. The doctor was treating patients when Chinese officials arrested him, furious that he had sounded the alarm over this mysterious virus exploding through the region. They made him sign a statement to keep him quiet. And again, the threat was, we solemnly warn you, if you keep being stubborn with such impertinence and continue this illegal activity, you will be brought to justice. Is that understood? It was the beginning of a massive regime-wide cover-up that claimed 19,000 lives and sent the global economy spiraling out of control. Tony Perkins continues by saying, now with the world in utter chaos, people dying faster in some countries than we can bury them, the fury over the deadly conspiracy foisted upon us by China is white hot. He then quotes leaders like Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who are watching with horror as the infections ravage America, are determined to hold the Chinese Communist Party responsible. He said since day one, they intentionally lied to the world about the origin of this pandemic. He talked about the orders for laboratories to destroy samples and the persecution of doctors like Li Wenliang, I just mentioned. It is time, Hawley suggested, for an international investigation. The Chinese Communist Party must be held to account for what the world is now suffering. And so we'll see where that goes. But as I shared with you yesterday, of course, there is already an attempt to put together sort of a class action suit as well. Let's hear from a few others. We've, of course, heard from Josh Hawley. Let's hear now from the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who, as Tony Perkins points out, whose agency is getting frantic calls from Americans trying to get home, understands better than anyone the human toll of China's action. The secretary said every day, every week matters in terms of how this information is transmitted around the world. That is, when we share this information, the best scientists around the world can begin to work on it. You can start all the processes, not only the vaccines and things that mitigate, but you can begin to put in place the things that will cause the spread to be decreased. And it's multiplicative. So every day that the Chinese Communist government and the Chinese Communist Party sat on this information and didn't do the right thing, they increased the number of people who would be exposed and thereby put all of us around the world, the Chinese people as well as all of us, at unnecessary risk. He says even now, as he said on Washington Watch, the disinformation campaign continues not just in China, but in Russia and Iran as well. They're talking about it coming from the U.S. government, coming from the U.S. Army, and they're saying that it maybe began in Italy, all things to deflect responsibility. And yes, countries have more urgent problems on their hands right now, but the world needs to understand what really is going on because it's that important. Well, we'll take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the impact of that that whole legacy of lies. But also, even though we've been talking about China, I want to focus a little bit of attention as well on Iran, because that's another place where the fatality rate or the mortality rate was much higher. We now know what was going on there as well. So we'll talk about this, and then we'll come back to this country and talk about the issue of hospital capacity in many places that has already passed the tipping point, especially in some of the coronavirus hotspots. So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, we'll have some time talking with Steve Moore right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a divided country. Os Guinness, in his book Last Call for Liberty, argues that the American Republic is suffering its greatest crisis since the Civil War, and he believes the root of this disagreement is two different definitions of freedom. One view of freedom is embodied in 1776 in the American Revolution. The other view arose in 1789 in the French Revolution. The first can be found in the Declaration of Independence that owes its formulation to the Protestant Reformation, and even earlier in the book of Exodus. The second can be found in France's Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité that ended in the Reign of Terror, to which we can add Marx's Triumph of the Proletariat and in the policies of Stalin and Mao Zedong. His book asks 10 questions that make up the chapters of the book. When he was in the studio with me talking about his book, I mentioned that few Americans could answer the questions in the affirmative. He asked, "Do you know where your freedom comes from?" Even fewer could offer good answers to questions like, "How do you plan to sustain freedom?" He also addresses the question, "How will you make the world safe for diversity?" Here we have two starkly different visions of public life. On the one side are proponents of what Richard John Neuhaus called a naked public square that would exclude religion and religious expressions from public life. Proponents of a sacred public square would give preference to one religion. He advocates for a civil public square where citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. This book provides wise counsel on how Christians can be at the forefront of bringing America back to its proper understanding of freedom. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Talking about China's legacy of lies. This has caused a lot of people to be very concerned, and if nothing else, illustrates why we need to continue to think about whether or not we want to continue doing business with China or being so dependent on them, and to recognize that their legacy of lies has put so many of us at risk. But again, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was talking about the fact that they were spreading lies, for example, that the U.S. Army or maybe were actually responsible for this coronavirus outbreak, or maybe it began in Italy. They're doing anything they can to deflect any attention on them. And so, again, as Tony Perkins points out, if nothing is done, this culture of lies will continue to cost the world innocent human lives. Again, Mike Pompeo said it's still important to have transparency even today. This is an ongoing global crisis, and we need to make sure that every country today is being transparent, sharing what's really going on so that the global community, the global health care, infectious disease community can begin to work on this in a holistic way. And that was, of course, his concern that this cover-up, this disinformation that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in is still denying the world the information it needs so that we can prevent further cases or something like this from recurring again. Right now, we're focusing on just this one, COVID-19, but there could be COVID-20, just as easily. There could be something else on the horizon. And so this is why cooperation with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party is essential. And this is why they have put us at risk. And so that is of great concern. But let me for a minute move away from China to Iran, because two of the places where the highest mortality rate or fatality rate is taking place are those two countries. Well, it turns out, Tony Perkins reminds us that in Iran, where the government also ignored the crisis, that's why the casualties were astronomical. Why did they ignore it? Because they wanted to have a high turnout for the February elections. So just as in China, they were denying that there was human-to-human transmission, and so as a result, allowed individuals to come together for the Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations and thus vastly increase the likelihood of transmission. So in Iran, because they wanted to increase and have a very high turnout for the February elections, ignored the virus, and then, of course, had astronomical, as Tony Perkins says, casualties. Now, of course, he says they're lying to their people and trying to, again, turn them against America because they know their grip on the regime is very tentative. But if they can shift their focus away from themselves, the Iranians can hide what they knew and when they knew it. But again, this is where the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo points out the people most harmed by the absence of transparency and good governance are the people of their own country. And that's true both of China and of Iran. So Tony Perkins ends with this. He says, so maybe, the Secretary said, one of the best outcomes we can hope for in this catastrophe is that we see a country like America treating people with dignity and respect. And the Secretary says those are the things that fundamentally separate us from regimes like Iran and the Chinese Communist Party. And that's why when we move our way through this, as I know we will, the people all around the world will see that it is our system, a republic where we have freedom and liberty, and we know that our rights come from our Creator. These are the systems that will ultimately prove to be the most effective in delivering good outcomes for every human being. So if nothing else, just wanted to make sure that you have that. And again, you can find some articles, one on the high price of the coronavirus relief, one on the Harvard study. And this is just one of many articles now that have come out on the coronavirus fatality or mortality rate seems to be much lower than what the World Health Organization has been promoting. And then this one on China's legacy of lies. But before we take a break and spend some time with Stephen Moore, let me pick up two other issues. Number one, I did mention that we, with these high capacity, very significant types of hospital situations, are crossing a tipping point, especially in two of the hot spots. And I'll look at New York and Washington State. First of all, they say hospitals in the pandemic epicenters have passed a tipping point in the fight against the new coronavirus, as the relentless climb in infections forces some to move patients to outlying facilities, divert ambulances, and even store bodies in refrigerated trucks. One example is New York, home to the nation's largest outbreak of COVID-19. The illness caused by the new coronavirus is rushing to build a temporary hospital in a Manhattan conference center in the hope of staying ahead of the fast-spreading disease. Hospitals in parts of New York City have become so full of critically ill patients, they have steered ambulances elsewhere. A full-to-capacity morgue in Queens is using a refrigerated truck to hold some of the dead. I won't make it any more than that. Some of you might be eating lunch. I don't want to make it any more gruesome. But let's, if we can, move to Seattle. And in the Seattle area, where you have the West Coast's largest outbreak, claimed 94 lives. According to the Johns Hopkins University data, hospitals are transferring patients to beds where they're available. And so there are people saying right now that they're in the hunt for looking for new places to put patients. One said, we're not completely drowning, although it feels like it at times, and we're on the threshold of being overwhelmed. So those are the two hot spots. And so if you would want to pray for those particular areas of the country, that would be the case. But just before we take a break, let me at least talk about one of the stories coming in today, and that is the indictments against Venezuela. And Tom Rogan puts it this way: welcome the U.S. drug trafficking indictments issued against Nicolas Maduro on Thursday. While greater constriction of Venezuelan oil exports will be necessary to ultimately remove the illegitimate president, this will certainly clarify why we do not seek a compromise that allows him to stay in power. Maduro is responsible for turning the world's oil-richest nation into a land of starving children, of corruption, and, of course, has been essentially a drug lord, if you want to get really blunt about this. And so these indictments are designed to put more pressure on at least the military figures to abandon Nicolas Maduro and put the legitimate interim president Juan Guaido in power. They go on to say that these indictments document Maduro's long-standing role in facilitating cocaine trafficking to the United States. They assert that he and other senior officials in his government have worked closely with the Colombian terrorist group, FARC, F-A-R-C, to enrich themselves at the expense of regional stability and human rights. And these indictments show that for all of the rhetoric coming from Nicolas Maduro, he is ultimately just a drug lord who has used power to fatten his belly as his people suffer around him. A few comments by Tom Rogan, and if nothing else, we recognize that these indictments are not going to remove this individual from power, but if nothing else, maybe it just very clearly clarifies why we do not need to establish some kind of relationship with Venezuela. As tragic as those human rights situations are, it's perhaps the most difficult part of our diplomacy. We look at North Korea, people starving. We look at Iran, people that have very little access to basic necessities. We look at Venezuela, where children are starving, and the tendency is to simply turn a blind eye to the leaders so that we can provide help to those individuals. But oftentimes, even when we send that foreign aid to those individuals, it just lines the pockets of those corrupt individuals. And these latest indictments of drug trafficking and becoming a drug lord illustrate again what has happened to a country that was actually so affluent and still has more oil resources than probably any other country in Latin America, in South America, and yet finds itself today on economic collapse because it had adopted a socialist idea where the few at the top are enriched and the rest lead a life of poverty. Let's take a break, though. Stephen Moore will be with us. We want to spend some time kind of looking at what were some of the successes of the Trump economic policy before the virus, where we are now, and what possibly could happen in the future. And if you'd like to join our conversation, of course, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to find some of the articles we've mentioned, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. And my Viewpoints commentary today is on the Oz Guinness book, Last Call for Liberty, which I would encourage you to read and maybe even pass it on to your friends and neighbors and coworkers just to talk about the importance of freedom and liberty in our world. We'll come back with Stephen Moore right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, again, passing a $2.2 trillion coronavirus relief bill by the Senate. It will now go to the House, and as it does before the vote tomorrow, maybe we'll have a better idea of some of what is in it, and we'll certainly report that to you as well. It was unanimous, 96 votes to 0, at a time when we have so much partisan divide, and even partisan divide that took place during the weekend. It is good to see that, but I am still skeptical about how much good it will do. But it is, if you will, sort of necessary. And it brings me to something I wanted to talk about with Steve Moore. We haven't connected up with him, and if we don't, we'll get him another day. But there was a very good piece that came out today by Henry Olson in the Washington Post. And it was, we're killing the economy over the coronavirus. We're putting it into a coma. In other words, he doesn't like the idea of killing the economy. He said many people are worried that social distancing and state lockdowns will kill the economy. He said that's the wrong analogy. The massive $2 trillion, if you will, stimulus bill is one of those individuals where he says it's not necessarily killing the economy, it's inducing a coma. Now, what do we mean by that? You know as well as I do that if somebody has had a traumatic injury, sometimes they will put people into a medically induced coma for their brain to heal. And he says what's going on right now is the lockdowns and social distancing are artificially suppressing economic activity because that's the best way to stop greater harm to society, the rapid spread of the coronavirus. As new infections subside and the risk of exponential widespread contagion falls, the coma will be reversed by removing restrictions. And then he argues that economic activity begins to come to life and the patient, that is us, will be healthier than we otherwise would have been the case. And so he takes you through kind of an argument, which I won't get into unless we have a chance to talk with Stephen Moore, but it's kind of one of those issues that maybe says we have to not necessarily think we're killing the economy, we're just putting it into a deep sleep, but eventually it will revive. There's another argument being used, and that is by Tom Giovannetti, who's been on the program with us before, actually been on with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because the two of them work together. And he doesn't like the word stimulus. And if you've noticed, I have tried not to use the word stimulus, maybe relief, because he says in this environment, stimulus isn't the point. No matter how much we cut taxes or encourage business investment, what's the point if the government is banning employees from coming to work or from going to restaurant stores and other establishments? Cutting or suspending the payroll tax does nothing to help laid-off employees, who don't even have a paycheck, much less a payroll tax to cut. It might help businesses that are only marginally affected, but will do nothing for the most harm. He said the more accurate way to view the government's role is through the lens of taking, the insurer of last resort. His argument is this: the Constitution allows government at all levels to take private property for public use, but it must provide just compensation. We most often encounter a taking through eminent domain. In other words, if you have a house right in the way of where they wanted to put a highway, they will say, we will buy your house from you. We will cover the cost of you no longer having that house. And, of course, that is the case. Well, and again, in times of disaster, when a government actor must seize a building to use as an emergency hospital, or if they have to set up, purposely set fire to a house or another structure in order to create a fire break, our Constitution requires government to provide just compensation. So his argument, I think it's a pretty good argument, is that the government's telling you you can't go to work. So the government, it's like setting fire to your house, like taking your house in eminent domain or something of that nature. The government should reimburse you. The only problem with that is I agree with the fact that government should reimburse you, but what they're doing is they're taking money from one hand and paying it in the other hand. You're going to have to pay your taxes. Maybe you don't have to pay them now till July 15th instead of August 15th, but then they're turning right around and giving you $1,200. I'm not sure all of that works very well, but nevertheless, that is kind of the issue that we face ourselves right now. And so one of the questions that people have had is, what will this look like in the future economically? And the argument has always been maybe a V. We last week, of course, talked with Kelly Shackelford about that. But now many people are saying it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to look like an elongated U because, after all, we are starting to see so many people unemployed. I've used Pennsylvania as an example. Those of you in the Keystone State are getting a lot of mention here today, but that's just the way it turned out. Because if you look at those numbers, those seem to be some of the largest right now, surprisingly. About 350,000 first-time claims for unemployment assistance. Just to compare that, when you look at national claims last year, it was about 200,000 for the entire country, and there are more in one state than there were for the entire country last year. And, of course, the news is going to get worse for not only Pennsylvania, but for all the states, the 42 different states in which we broadcast, and so that is the case. And Goldman Sachs has estimated that the U.S. GDP will not be a +3 or even +4 like it was, or even plus 0.5% like it was even during some of those years under Barack Obama, but a -24%, and I will see how that plays out. But the hope is that by the third quarter, and that could be starting in July all the way to, say, September, maybe. I don't believe it, but they say it could be, again, 12% or something of that nature, because ultimately you would pick it back up and it would be a rapid rise. I think that's just maybe too much. But nevertheless, that's one idea being proposed. But the biggest issue is what you do once we no longer have any kind of major restrictions. And that, of course, leads to the big question. You know, the president the other day made the comment about the fact that he would like to have things back to normal by Easter. Well, Easter is April 12th. I have my doubts. Maybe a lot of people standing behind him had their doubts. But if that is the case, even if we are somewhat back to normal, even by Memorial Day weekend, which is maybe more realistic, or the 4th of July weekend, which I think is even more realistic, still consumer spending accounts for 70% of GDP. So the bottom line is, if people have been waiting to go to restaurants, waiting to buy clothes, waiting to go and purchase flat screen television sets, waiting to go on vacations, then 70% of GDP, which is actually done through consumer spending, it will have a very rapid rise. I have my doubts, and I could be wrong on that, because I think by the time some of that happens, people will have missed a paycheck or two. And so now they might be deeper in debt. They might have credit card debt. They might be a little scared. Even if you talk about getting on an airplane, you know, there may be some people that say, well, I know we're supposed to go and travel, but I think I'm still willing to postpone my vacation a little bit longer just to make sure, because I don't want to see this virus getting brought down and then take off again. Unfortunately, that happened in Hong Kong. And so these could take a lot longer, and people might be less willing to travel too far or too soon. And so that could be another real issue. And so if nothing else, this V-shaped recovery, as he says in this particular piece here, which is written by Andrew Studefort, is maybe going to look more like a poorly drawn U, and so we'll see where that plays itself out. But if nothing else, we do have a great opportunity to begin to watch what will happen, and if we do have some evidence in a few of these hot spots that some of this could be flattening, and don't know how accurate some of those numbers are and how that plays out over the next couple of days, maybe we'll be able to recover. So that is the case. Since it looks like we probably won't have Stephen Moore today, when we come back, I want to take on a couple of other issues. One of those is the number of claims that have been made that President Trump said this, which he did not, and the argument that President Trump told individuals to go out there and ingest hydroxychloroquine, and somebody actually ingested chloroquine phosphate. And if you're not familiar with that, that actually is a chemical that's used to clean aquariums. And so we'll get into that issue and a variety of other claims that have been made, and we'll then wind down the program for today. And first of all, let me, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we'll have our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis will be with us. I believe both of them will be in studio with us, and if that is the case, we'll be glad to see their smiling faces, and we'll cover much more, including by that time maybe we'll have a pretty good idea of what is in that bill that the Senate passed. $2.2 trillion. Unbelievable. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow, of course, we're going to have our weekend edition and Penna Dexter's commentary, which we will make available tomorrow, called Coronavirus and Government. And she points out something that is going to be very concerning if it happens in this country, because it has been happening in Italy. And that is, doctors in Italy have had to make decisions about who to treat and who to allow to die. Penna Dexter talks about the fact that in Italy, doctors know how to treat severe cases, but they need ventilators in intensive care units. They simply don't have enough beds or equipment to do so. They don't even have enough doctors. And so there are stories of patients languishing in hospital corridors, doctors having to make increasingly tough calls. And she quotes from one of the economics writers for the Wall Street Journal, Joseph Sternberg, who says that the problem is simply this. It's not the result of the severity of the COVID-19 virus, but more due to Italy's long-term failure to invest in its healthcare system. And if you want to see how that plays out, I might point you to the recent commentary by John Stonestreet, in which he talks about this tragic question of deciding who gets treated and who does not. He says in Italy, reports are emerging that doctors like the one he interviewed the other day are being forced to ration medical care. Should a bed and care be given to an 85-year-old with a low chance of survival, or a 45-year-old with a much better chance of survival? Or, as another Italian doctor described, should doctors take into account whether older patients have families who can take care of them once they leave the ICU because they will need help? And so he talks about the fact that these decisions that these Italian officials are actually being forced to make is what's called triage. And triage, of course, comes from the word for three. You know, you actually set aside those individuals who have maybe in war superficial wounds. You can get to them later. You have a second group who have such significant wounds, you treat them immediately. And the third group, you simply set them aside to allow them to die. And so that is the case. And so those are some issues that we might be able to address. But I am informed now that we are privileged to have for just a few minutes Stephen Bure, who, of course, is an individual that was the president of Club for Growth, also has been a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and, of course, with Larry Kudrow, wrote a book, worked on tax policy, and also with Arthur Laffer, wrote a book on Trumponomics. And, Steve, it's just great to have you on this program with us today, your own point of view.
Well, it's so good to be with you. I apologize to be late. I was on a conference call with some folks at the White House, but thank you so much for having me.
Well, I guess the question a lot of people would like to ask is, we've been talking about whether or not this economy is going to be killed or whether it's in a coma. That was one thing that somebody was saying in the Washington Post. Others say, is it going to be a V-shaped recovery or U-recovery? What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of months?
Well, a couple things. First of all, we passed this $2 trillion bill yesterday, and one of the things I get so annoyed about is when the media calls this a stimulus bill. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't stimulate the economy when you pass out checks to people and you increase unemployment insurance benefits. So we do need – so the answer to your question is absolutely we need an Economic Recovery Act so that when we get this economy up and running again, and Donald Trump is so right, we should have a date certain. Easter Sunday is a great date to shoot for that we, really hit the ground running and we explode out of this. And that's what you just said. That's the V-shaped recovery. You have a steep decline, which we're going to have. We're going to lose probably about 15, maybe 20% of GDP because of the lockdown on the economy. And then you want to just, like a cannonball, you shot out, you want to just boom out of this, and you need some policies in place to do that. So I think that there's a lot of talk right now. That's what I was on the White House call talking about. How do we get the economy moving? I like the idea of suspending the payroll tax for the rest of the year so that you give every worker a 7.5% raise, and that incentivizes more work. And then you give every employer a 7.5% cut in their payroll costs, so that encourages them to hire more. So we need policies like that.
And so, again, some people have said that maybe what we're doing is, as one writer for the Washington Post said, we're putting it in a coma. Sometimes you have a medically induced coma, but the patient comes out. And the argument would be that once you remove these restrictions, I think consumer spending, which accounts for about 70% of GDP, would come roaring back. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, remember, the economic process starts with production. So the first thing we need to absolutely do is get businesses up and operational again, because nobody can consume, no matter how much money you pour out of the windows of the helicopters. It doesn't matter how many $100 bills you let fly out. If there's not a production of goods and services, there's nothing for people to buy. So we got to get the businesses up and running, and that's why I think the loan program for these businesses is good, because we don't want healthy businesses or businesses that were healthy a month ago. We want to let them get through this so they can get going as soon as as soon as we're out of the coma, so to speak. So what worries me is that in this bill that we just passed, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this bill we just passed has 4 months of 100% guaranteed pay in unemployment insurance for every worker in America. That's ridiculous. I mean, how are you going to get people back on the job?
Yeah, it's a disincentive.
Yeah, it is. It is bad.
Well, we did mention it in passing, but since I'm almost running out of time, I thought I'd just get one more comment. $2.2 trillion passes the Senate, goes to the House. They have put a lot of ornaments on this Christmas tree, and I think all of us would be skeptical about whether or not that $2.2 trillion is well spent. But I sense that you still think that's what we needed to do at this point, and we can't maybe fiddle with this bill any longer because there's a real need out there, both in production and in consumption, right?
Well, not exactly. We needed a $1 trillion bill, not a $2 trillion bill.
Yes.
This thing it became a Christmas tree. And so I'm really worried about that because, at some point we have to worry about, we're going to be running $4 or $5 trillion deficit this year.
I know.
So that's a big problem. But the most important thing is we got to get our businesses back up and running. We got to get workers back on the job. As we talk, I see the Dow is up 1,300 points. How awesome is that? So, we're seeing, I think when Trump announced that he wanted to get the businesses reopened, we've seen almost a 3,000 point increase in the Dow Jones. That's amazing.
That is. And again, let me just mention
4,000. Sorry, they just put it on the TV screen. The Dow is up 3,900 points.
3,000.
Trump announced that. Yeah.
Well, we were expecting to bounce a little bit, and let me again recommend your book, Trumponomics, because I'm fearful that about 3 or 4 months from now, people are going to forget all the good economic news and just look at what we are right now. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, but maybe we'll do it in the future. And thanks for being willing to jump on for a few minutes with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much. Love your show, and let's do it again soon.
Thank you very much. And again, I think you can understand that, as I've said before, members of Congress do not control their lives. People that are advisors to the president do not control their lives. So there were all sorts of other questions we would love to have asked Stephen Moore, but I'm glad he jumped on quickly enough to give us a little bit of an update. And that's kind of what we've been talking about today here on Point of View. We'll talk about more of it tomorrow. I agree with him. Even $1 trillion might be more than we needed to spend. $2 trillion? No. And a lot of ornaments put on that Christmas tree, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Debbie Georgiadis, Penna Dexter will be with us, and we've tried to cover a lot of different topics very quickly today, but tomorrow we'll have a little more leisurely look at that with two very smart women around the table giving us some perspective as we look at what is happening in the government, and we'll try to give you an update on where we are in terms of the coronavirus as well as the economic recovery. I'm not going to call it a stimulus. It's a recovery at best. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.